The UFC has the vast majority of the best MMA talent in the world, but that doesn't mean that it's the best place for the vast majority of the best MMA talent in the world. Today I'm going to talk about two fighters that I really believe will thrive outside of the UFC. Now, one of them was released about 10 days ago, one of the biggest MMA stories of the year. No surprises here. It's Cris Cyborg. And then the other person I'm going to talk about is a person who just won over this past weekend, actually, looked pretty good in their victory, and is currently under UFC contract with no real end sign in sight, and that's Mickey Gall. Now, you might be wondering why I'm going to talk about Mickey Gall, since he's under UFC contract and there's no end sign in sight. But before I get into talking about him, I would actually like to reverse engineer this topic a little bit and talk about a couple of guys who really do thrive under the UFC's umbrella. Now, the first guy I'm going to talk about here is Conor McGregor. Now, if you think about the way that Conor rose to stardom, he was able to develop his skills on the European regional circuit and in small Irish promotions until he had skills where he knew he could compete with the very best fighters in the world, and at that point he made his transition over to the UFC and was able to quickly rise through the ranks because of his ability to win fights impressively and his ability to talk a big game. So the key there was that he was able to develop in obscurity, and once he was fully developed, more or less, or at least highly developed in terms of the maturation of his skill set, at that point, he was able to take over the UFC. Now let's look at a second example here. A guy who is one of the biggest names in the sport, had a huge win over in the main event on this past weekend, Colby Covington. Now Colby Covington, if you look at the way Colby rose to stardom, it was he did it fighting inside the UFC the whole time, or for the recent past of his career, I should say. But he did a lot of his skill developing inside the UFC, and the reason why he was able to skill develop inside the UFC is because he did it in obscurity. Like, I saw Colby Covington fight on the undercard of UFC Ottawa 3 years ago against Jonathan Munier, and nobody knew Colby. He was fighting on the undercard on a fight night. He was totally living in obscurity inside the UFC's roster. So he was able to skill develop in obscurity, and then once he was very confident that his skills were amongst the best in the world and he knew he could compete with anybody, then he started talking a very big game, and then that's when his platforms expanded, and that's when his stardom grew and his personal brand grew, and he started to gain notoriety. Now, Mickey Gall, under no fault of his own, came into the UFC with a lot of notoriety, even though he was only a 1-0 fighter, which is basically unheard of to be a 1-0 fighter in the UFC. Now, his first couple of UFC fights were obviously not real UFC fights. He fought Mike Jackson and CM Punk, but then he was a 3-0 fighter, but he's still stuck under the UFC umbrella, and he's a very young green fighter who needed to be in a major skill developing part of his career. But he's already got a big name. He's already on the biggest MMA platforms like Ariel Helwani's MMA show. All the big outlets are talking about him. He's even on big comedy podcasts in LA, and very, very popular. And I love Mickey Gall. So he's a very, very popular fighter, but he's still in the developmental stage in his career, and he doesn't have the luxury of being able to develop in obscurity like Conor and Colby did. And developing under the spotlight in the UFC is just not the place to develop. Now, one place where you can develop under the spotlight is in Bellator. Bellator has proven that they can develop fighters for long-term success, and while they're developing them for long-term success, these fighters also make great short-term monetary gains and great short-term gains in terms of building their brands. Like, think about a guy like Dylan Dennis, the kind of organizational push he gets from Bellator, even though he's a 2-0 guy, and he gets to fight these cans, for lack of a better term. So he gets all this in-cage experience without the threat of fighting the best fighters in the world, which is what you have to do in the UFC to get in-cage experience. So I just think Mickey would really benefit from being able to develop in a smaller league where he can get more favorable matchups. He can gain in cage experience, and Bellator can build his highlight reel, use him for promotional things. It benefits them. He could get his own sponsorships. He can get out from under that Reebok umbrella, which would really benefit him because I think he's already very popular, so he's very marketable. I'm sure sponsors would jump at the chance to sponsor him because he's such a marketable guy in the sport. So he would just be I think he's just a much better suit for Bellator at this point in his career. Because think about it, he's only 27 years old now. Let's say this is an ideal situation for what I'm talking about with Mickey Gall. Mickey could fight out his last couple of fights. I'm not sure how many fights he has left on his UFC contract. I wish I could know that, but I tried looking it up. I couldn't find it. Let's say he's got 2 or 3 fights left tops, right? He could fight that out in the next year. You try to fight as mild of opponents as possible. And then you pivot over to Bellator. You can get your own sponsorships. You can get a big money deal over there. You can get a great organizational push over there. And you could probably spend the next couple of years while you're developing your skills. You could develop this big rivalry with Dillon Danis. Dillon Danis needs a foil over there, and he needs somebody on a lower MMA level. I'm not saying Mickey Gall's in low-level MMA by any stretch, but he's not at the Rory McDonald level. He's at a level where you could, while Dillon is skill developing for the next couple of years and Mickey's skill developing for the next couple of years, you could have them knocking off cans in tandem, talking shit to each other, and that could be the next great original Bellator rivalry after the MVP Daily type of thing. Like, think about MVP is a perfect example of somebody who is able to skill develop in Bellator to a point where now he's an elite fighter, household name, marketable guy, made tons of money. So it's so good for your long-term and short-term development to be in Bellator. And the thing is, so Mickey could, let's say, like I said, 2 or 3 fights in the UFC, get over to Bellator, fight over there for a few years, and then get into his prime and have a huge highlight reel behind him at that point. And then he could leverage back over to the UFC at a point where he would actually be competitive in the top 10 type of thing, and he can make his UFC run at that point. Because you want to make your UFC run as a developed fighter, a fully developed fighter. You don't want to develop in the UFC unless if you can do so in obscurity like Colby Covington did that I was explaining earlier. So that's what I would really like to see from Mickey Gall. That's a lot of speculation, and I understand it might have been a little bit convoluted to explain. So this Cyborg situation, a lot less speculation. Let's get into why she would thrive outside of the UFC. And I think there's two main reasons. One of them is kind of unfair for me to talk about, but let's just it's the elephant in the room. Let's talk about PEDs. Now with Cris Cyborg, she has tested positive for stanozol, I believe that's how you pronounce it, which is a serious performance-enhancing drug. She tested positive for that in the past. And under USADA, Cris Cyborg in the last 3 years has been tested 48 times. That's once every 3 or 4 weeks. She has somebody come to wherever she is. She has to give her whereabouts like she's a criminal on parole to these people at all times, and she has to get woken up unannounced. You don't know when it's going to come at like 5 or 6 in the morning, and you get blood drawn, and then you have to urinate in front of this weirdo in a lab coat or whatever. I mean, just imagine getting woken up and having to pee in front of somebody. Just like the level of privacy, like just being breached. Like, ugh. You don't even consider that, but let's just think about that, like being tested 48 times and having to give your whereabouts, like just how annoying that would be. And then outside of that, now if she wants to use PEDs, it would be a lot easier for her to do so. And the thing about PEDs is they're performance enhancing drugs. I mean, that's what they're called, PEDs. And if your performance is enhanced, then it's safe to assume that you're going to be more entertaining. And if you're more entertaining, more people are going to want to watch you. And if more people are going to want to watch you, then you can demand more money. So I think Cris Cyborg's earning potential probably it goes up significantly going outside of the UFC, because it just gives her the option to use PEDs if she so chooses. And that not only increases her capabilities to fight on like a fight by fight basis, so it improves her earning power short term, but it would potentially extend her career, so it could extend her long term earning capabilities as well. So that was the unfair thing to talk about. I understand it's really unfair to talk about PEDs, so let's not. We can even ignore that whole PED argument. Although I think it is valid, we can even ignore that and say that Cris Cyborg will thrive outside of the UFC because of the professional flexibility that's afforded to her outside of the UFC. By professional flexibility, I mean she can sign inexclusive contracts. Like in the UFC, it's an exclusive contract. You're just competing for the UFC, nothing else. If she's to sign with Scott Coker and Bellator, Scott Coker, I'm sure, would allow her to do cross-promotional fights with Ryzen because they have a good relationship over there. So she could do big fights in Japan. I'm sure she could do big boxing matches, big kickboxing matches, Muay Thai matches. You know, she can do across a whole span of sports, not just competing in mixed martial arts under one banner. She could compete in mixed martial arts under many banners and in many other sports. You could also potentially do, maybe if she's in Bellator, she could do a cross-promotional super, maybe we could do a cross-promotional super fight with Kayla Harrison from the PFL. You know, if Cyborg's in the UFC, there's a 0% chance of a cross-promotional super fight. If she's in Bellator, there is a chance. Of course, she could also just enter the PFL lightweight tournament for next year and try to fight Kayla Harrison that way. I don't think that makes sense for Cyborg, and I don't think she would do that because, like I said, I think the professional flexibility is the best thing afforded to her being outside the UFC. And if you're in a year-long tournament, you know, that's not really professional flexibility. You're kind of stuck competing in that MMA organization against the same fighters. You don't really have the variety available to you. So that's why, yeah, they could do a super fight. I'm sure PFL would be interested, Bellator would be interested, MMA fans would be interested. So there's just a lot more opportunities for Cyborg outside of the UFC. It's unfortunate we're not going to get to see the Amanda Nunes rematch, but I mean, I think we're going to get to see a lot more other exciting things with Cyborg. Like I said, multiple sports, cross-promotion, and maybe a juiced-up Cyborg that is even more violent. Who knows? But what do you think? What do you think? Which fighters do you think are currently under the UFC that would thrive outside of the UFC? Do you agree with the two fighters that I'm talking about here, saying that they would thrive outside of the UFC? Please comment below. Talk to me about this stuff. Like the video. Please subscribe to the channel. Follow me on socials. And until next time, cheers, ladies and gents.